Hello, welcome to this session of the online course for ethics committees. Today we are going to talk about the rationale and the science that is the main part of any study protocol. So, the objectives for this session are for both the investigators as well as the ethics committee members who are going to review the proposal that is submitted by the investigators. We will look at how to examine a rationale for the research topic that is suggested in the protocol, and also some key points to review the scientific validity or the methodology that is proposed in the research proposal. When we look at any research proposal, one of the most important thing that drives the research question that is tried to be answered in the study is the rationale of the study. Why are we doing this study? Why have we written this protocol? The questions that come to mind and that need to be adequately answered in the study proposal are threefold. One, is the research question appropriate? Secondly, what is currently known and unknown about the topic that we are trying to study? And finally, ultimately, what are the benefits that we expect from the study? An ethics committee as well as the investigator, when he or she is writing the proposal, needs to be very mindful of being able to answer all these three questions appropriately. The first question that the investigator needs to answer is whether the research question that he or she is attempting to study through the proposed proposal, is it appropriate? In order to understand that, we need to understand what a research question is and how a research question is framed. Basically, a research question is nothing but an uncertainty about something in the population that the study investigator wants to know and resolve by doing the study itself. Basically, it is what we call, epidemiologists would call as, what is the data that is needed to convert that uncertainty into certainty. Why do we need a good research question? A good research question is really essential in order to facilitate choosing an appropriate study design for the study that is proposed. A good research question drives home who we are going to be studying, the study population. A good research question also helps to clearly tell us what the study outcomes are and what do we need to measure in order to appropriately answer the research question. So, in order to translate this uncertainty into research questions, what an investigator needs to keep in mind and what an ethics committees need to keep in mind when they are reviewing the proposals is whether that the research question is actually something that frames the problems in specific terms. The problem could be clinical, could be related to public health, could be a laboratory based issue, could be community based. The research question should be such that it focuses on one issue that the investigator wants to study. If there are multiple issues that are being proposed to be studied in a proposal, then it is always better to have multiple research questions, each focusing on one specific issue. Again, the research question needs to be written in an everyday language. For example, what is the burden of a specific health problem in the specified study population? Why do certain people behave in a certain way, so on and so forth. A research question can use more than one operational verb is needed, but it is always a good practice to stick to one operational verb in one research question, and if there is more that is needed, then that can go into separate research questions. A research question is not only a question, but it should also link to the potential action or the potential benefit that would be achieved by at the end of the study. So, the research question should be, what is the burden, say for example, if you want to know, say the burden of tuberculosis in a particular population. So, the research question could be something like what is the burden of tuberculosis in the particular population in order to provide appropriate diagnostic and management services. And finally, research question should always be stated as a question and not just as a statement. So, there has to be a question mark at the end of a question and it is framed as a question. Another thing to note down is that how do we understand whether the research question that an investigator has framed, is it really a good research question? There is one very easy test to do that and what we know as the so what test. How does it matter? There is a certain criteria that in both investigators as well as ethics committee members can actually look into to actually identify whether the proposed research question is a good one, and this is what is known as the finer criteria. The research question should be something that is feasible to answer. There should be adequate expertise, manpower and resources available to the investigators. The research question should be interesting not only to the investigators, but also to the proposed funders, to the general community at large. The research question should ideally be novel. It should add something new to what is already known, or it may refute a finding that is already there. Of course, the research question has to be answered in an ethical manner, keeping in mind the rights of the study participants. And finally, the research question has to be relevant to so that it benefits in terms of both practice or policy or relevance to the priorities that are existing in the existing setting where the research question or the study is proposed to be undertaken. The second question that we need to look at when we are trying to understand whether the rationale of the study is appropriate is to see whether the investigator has appropriately gone into what is currently known and unknown about the study topic and eventually framed a research question to answer the unknown. A very simple way to do that is actually the review of literature. A good review of literature in fact helps the investigator to understand what the current knowledge is. The investigator should have synthesized appropriately the results of the literature that he or she has looked into to come to an understanding of what is the current gap as it appears in the literature and develop an appropriate research question around it. Ethics committee members should go through the proposal to understand whether this process has been adequately taken care of in the review of literature and in the way the background and the rationale of the study has been proposed in the proposal. And then thirdly, very importantly, we need to understand whether the study that is being proposed is beneficial in multiple ways. Now, what could be these expected benefits from any study? The study could be that it fulfills a knowledge gap that is existing currently, or it may refute something that is already known. The study results may be something that may be helpful to change the current practices, whether it is clinical practice or behavioral practices or public health related issues. The results of the study may help to change policy or to modify policy in a certain way. And finally, and very importantly, the key is whether the study has a social value. How does it impact the society and the community at large? In order to understand whether the investigator has appropriately thought about the social value of research, some of the key things that we could look into is when at the end of the study, would the study help in improving the health and well-being of the study participants themselves? ultimately, if the study is shown to be beneficial among the study participants, would it be possible to scale it up to improve the health of the whole target population? There can be other ways in which the studies could be useful, where maybe it brings in certain resources in terms of maybe the diagnostic equipments or the clinical acumen or certain practices that were not existing before, and it improves the current practices. Maybe once if the study improves the knowledge gap, then maybe it will improve the expertise in the field, and ultimately very importantly we need to be mindful of the context in which the study is being undertaken, and whether in the local context the results of the study would be beneficial in line with what the priorities are in terms of the local situation. Once we are sure of that a proposal has a justifiable rationale, the next part of the proposal to be looked into is to look into the scientific validity of the proposal, which basically means the methodology that is proposed in the study in order to answer the research question, how appropriate that is, and the appropriateness can be judged in two ways. We have what is known as the internal validity of a study as well as an external validity. Internal validity refers to all the methodological issues that are proposed in the study, and it actually helps us to understand whether we would at the end of the study results how accurate they will be in studying whatever are the study parameters that has been suggested within the study population. Finally, on the basis of the results of this particular study, we should be able to accurately estimate and generalize the findings of the study to the relevant target populations, and if that is in a study which does that, has what is we call as an external validity. Internal validity is key to making a good study proposal. There are probably three main elements that go into ensuring a good internal validity. The ethics committee needs to look into whether the study objectives have been clearly stated, whether the study design that is proposed to answer the study research question, how valid it is, and whether it is appropriate to answer the particular research question, and ultimately the methodological issues, how well have they been delineated, so that we could make a valid conclusion at the end of the analysis from when we get the study results. In terms of the objectives, we could look at whether the objectives have been appropriately framed and written in a scientific manner and using epidemiological terms. The objectives depending on the research question could be descriptive or analytical, where that is whether they are measuring a quantity. So, for example, if you are estimating prevalence or proportion or incidence, then that would be a descriptive question, such as say to estimate the prevalence of HIV in prison inmates, for example. Now, an analytical question would be a question that is testing a hypothesis, which is essentially if you are trying to find out the risk factors or the protective factors related to the outcome, and that is when you would have an analytical question. Many a times, and not necessarily all the time, these objectives actually can be sorted into primary and secondary objectives, and which actually tell us what the focus of the study is and what are the additional analysis that could be done from the same study. Study design is key to answering a research question in an appropriate manner. An appropriate study design is ultimately critical to ensure internal validity of a study. In general, we can divide these study designs into quantitative and qualitative types. The quantitative study designs are the usual epidemiological study designs, which can again be divided into two main categories of observational studies and experimental studies. Observational studies could be descriptive studies such as case series, case studies, and the surveys, the cross sectional design. whereas analytical studies are those which are trying to find out the etiologies and risk factors, wherein we have the case control studies and the cohort studies, wherein we have two groups of people and we are comparing them. Then of course, if the design is experimental, it could be either randomized or non-randomized, and so we could have randomized trials. These could be clinical trials, these could even be community based trials, and then we could even have quasi experimental studies, wherein we essentially do not randomize, but we still compare two groups. The other designs, the other paradigm of study designs is what we know, what are known as qualitative study designs or qualitative methods, which could involve observations, which could involve interviews such as in depth interviews and focus group discussions, or it could even be ethnographic studies. Qualitative study designs are more appropriate to answer the question why. Why do certain people do certain things? Why do we see certain behaviors? Why are certain practices prevalent or not prevalent? And qualitative study designs are very good to answering those kinds of questions. We could even actually have a mix of both quantitative and qualitative designs, and if that is something that is warranted based on the research question, the objectives, and have an optimal mix of both the approaches in order to fully able to answer the research question and the objective at hand. A major part of the study proposal is the methods, and we need both the investigator as well as the ethics committee that is reviewing the proposal needs to ensure that all the methodological issues are taken care of, and we are doing studies which are methodologically valid. Some of the key things that need to be ensured is how the investigator has defined the outcomes and the exposures that are going to be measured in the study population. Are the operational definitions for each of these measurements clearly defined? What is the sampling design, and how appropriately is the sample size calculated for that particular design? The investigator needs to clearly sort of spell out how the data is going to be collected. Is it going to be interviewer based? Is it going to be observations? Is there going to be abstraction of data from other records? What are the tools, the questionnaires, the schedules, the data collection forms? What is the information that is going to be collected? Who is going to collect it? What is going to be the frequency, etc. And finally, the proposal needs to contain a clear data analysis plan, which shows how the investigator proposes to analyze the data that is collected in order to achieve the stated objectives. The ethics committee is responsible to also review the scientific validity of a proposal that it receives for scrutiny. In many institutions, there could be separate committees, a technical or a scientific committee, which may be looking into the scientific validity and the rationale of the study, and these committees could be either internal within the institution, or there could even be external committees if the investigator has submitted proposals to outside funding agencies, and which have their own review mechanisms. So, that is one source of understanding how well the study is scientifically written up and proposed. Now, when the ethics committee reviews the proposals and when it looks into the scientific validity of any proposal, if there has been a prior review by a competent technical or a scientific committee, the ethics committees should take into consideration the recommendations of those of the prior reviews, and that would actually help the ethics committee to come to a good decision in terms of the scientific validity. The reviewers who are actually looking into the scientific validity portion of the proposals should be somebody who is competent in terms of their expertise in that particular area and an expertise in terms of the methodology that is being proposed by the investigator. In case of need, the ethics committees could also invite certain subject matter experts or methodological experts, epidemiologists or statisticians or people working in the particular topic that the investigator has proposed, in order to get a good sense of how valid scientifically the study is valid and how the methodological issues have been taken care of in the proposal. As per guidelines, we know that these external experts, although they would not have a decision making power in terms of reviewing the proposal, but their expertise would be really valuable to come to a decision of whether the proposed study is scientifically valid. It is said that bad research is unethical research. A study which is irrationally conceived, study that is poor in terms of its justification, or a study that is poorly designed is considered unethical. Remember that one of the key ethical principles of the three is non-maleficence and beneficence. So, a badly designed study actually does more harm to not only the study participants, but also to the investigator, and it is also a waste of resources of the funding agencies. So, it is very critical that while we are reviewing any study protocol, we make sure that the suggested study is justified within the context that it is being done, and the methods that are being proposed are scientifically valid. Thank you.